Welcome to the Summary of Hiroshima by John Hersey. Let's uncover the gems together. Key Point 1. A tragic milestone in human history. In 1945, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, marking the first use of nuclear weapons. The bombings killed an estimated 140,000 people in Hiroshima and about 74,000 in Nagasaki. Tragically, the nightmare didn't end with the initial explosions. For many of the survivors, it was the beginning of a lifelong battle with various types of cancer, chronic illnesses, psychological trauma, and other terrible side effects of radiation poisoning. Grief is a testament to the depth of attachment, teaching people to coexist with loss. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the bomb wiped out most of the Hiroshima residents, but these people survived. Mrs. Hatsuyo Nakamura, a tailor with 3 children, Father Wilhelm Kleinsorge, a German priest, Dr. Terufumi Sasaki, a surgeon at the Red Cross Hospital, Reverend Mr. Kiyoshi Tanimoto, a pastor, Ms. Toshiko Sasaki, an office worker, Dr. Masakazu Fuji, the owner of a private clinic. Prepare yourself for a sobering reminder of the catastrophic potential of nuclear weapons and humanity's responsibility to ensure such horrors will never happen again. Key Point 2. When the bomb dropped. Of all the important cities in Japan, only Kyoto and Hiroshima had not experienced the devastating presence of the B-29 bombers. Rumors kept everyone on edge, hinting that the Americans had a special surprise planned. You never know when small choices will impact your life, but being open to them is the only way to find out. On August 6th, Mr. Tanimoto had his wife stay in Ushida while he moved items from his church to a house in Koi, where they would be safer. His friend, Mr. Matsuo, was helping him. As they paused to rest, a tremendous flash of light cut across the sky. Mr. Matsuo dashed inside, and Tanimoto threw himself between 2 giant rocks. He felt pressure, then debris fell on him. When Tanimoto lifted his head, the house had collapsed. Panicked, he forgot about Matsuo and ran into the street. Dust clouds darkened the day, obscuring soldiers emerging from a dugout, bloodied and dazed. On the other side of town, Mrs. Hatsuyo Nakamura tried to maintain a facade of normalcy for her children, Toshio, Yaiko, and Mieko. She stood by the kitchen window, preparing rice, lost in thoughts of her late husband. He had passed away in Singapore, leaving her to support her family with the modest income she earned from sewing. Suddenly, she saw a flash of light, and an explosion threw her into the next room. Despite the chaos, she clawed through the wreckage and found her children alive, miraculously with only bruises. August 6 did not start well for Dr. Masakazu Fuji either. He got up earlier than usual. The morning was hot and marked by the sound of air raid sirens. Dr. Fuji sat on a bench near the river with a fresh newspaper. He had evacuated almost every patient, leaving only 10 people in the hospital, including his niece. Suddenly, he saw a bright yellow flash that threw him into the water. The remains of the hospital floated around him. Key Point 3. Encountering the deadly flash. Dr. Terufumi Sasaki woke from a nightmare and left for work earlier than usual, unknowingly saving himself from the blast's epicenter. When the bomb hit, he was carrying a blood sample, which splattered across the wall. His glasses flew off and his shoes got knocked away, but he miraculously remained uninjured. Most patients and staff died instantly, while others were severely injured by glass shards, screaming in pain amid scattered medical instruments. Believing the attack targeted the hospital, Dr. Sasaki immediately began helping the wounded. He was unaware that all over Hiroshima, injured and dying citizens were heading to the Red Cross Hospital, soon overwhelming him and making him work tirelessly for days. Meanwhile, Father Wilhelm Kleinsorge felt unwell after getting food poisoning the day before. Despite this, he read Mass in the mission chapel for a few devout worshippers. After Mass, Father Kleinsorge laid down to read, but suddenly saw a dreadful flash. Thinking the bomb had hit the chapel, he ran into the mission's vegetable garden in his underwear. All the nearby buildings except the Jesuit mission house were destroyed. If we relinquish responsibility for our lives to others, we dwell in the shadow of their expectations. Not far away, Miss Toshiko Sasaki woke at 3 a.m. to prepare food for her father and sister while her mother stayed at the hospital with her brother. By 7 a.m., she left for work. Once there, Miss Sasaki started organizing her things at her desk near a pair of tall bookcases. Just as she was about to speak to a colleague, a blinding light suddenly filled the room. Paralyzed by fear, she lost consciousness. The ceiling collapsed, and the bookcases fell, crushing her leg. In a city of 245,000, nearly 100,000 people had been killed or doomed at one blow. John. Key Point 4. In the heart of chaos. Immediately after the explosion, Reverend Mr. Tanimoto recalled a hill with a clear view of the entire city of Hiroshima. There, he saw the city engulfed in thick smoke from burning buildings. As he turned away, he spotted his friend, Mr. Matsuo, who had also survived. Relieved, Mr. Tanimoto ran toward the city, encountering countless injured people on his way there. He found his wife and daughter both safe, but in shock. They exchanged brief greetings before Mr. Tanimoto ran to help the wounded. He carried water and ferried people to Asano Park, the designated evacuation area. A person's response to stress can vary greatly. Approach each case with respect and patience. At the same time, Mrs. Hatsuyo Nakamura dressed her children in whatever clothes she could salvage from the rubble. Urged to flee to Asano Park, she reluctantly left, carrying only emergency supplies. She tossed her sewing machine into a water tank on her way out, unsure if she would ever return for it. As they fled, they saw the Jesuit mission house, the only building still standing. Due to the explosion, Dr. Masakazu Fuji's hospital had collapsed into the river. Bloodied and dirty, he observed the destruction from Kyo Bridge. Only a few fires were initially visible, but the wind spread them quickly. Forced off the bridge by blasts of hot air, he lost sight of his niece and never saw her again. Meanwhile, Miss Sasaki was still trapped in the rubble, losing consciousness from the pain. She could only hear screams and cries until some men pulled her out. Her left leg was badly broken, hanging askew below the knee. The rescuers took her into a courtyard where, unable to move, she waited in the rain until a man carried her under a makeshift shelter. Her rescuer then brought 2 severely wounded people to share the space. As the rain cleared and the day grew hot, the smell from their injuries became unbearable. As the fire approached Asano Park, Mr. Tanimoto organized efforts to fight it, though many succumbed to the chaos, and the roar of planes only added to the panic. Late in the afternoon, he and Father Kleinsorg found roasted pumpkins and rice in town and fed nearly 100 people. Key point 5. The day after the catastrophe. On August 7th, an announcement echoed throughout Hiroshima all day, stating that a naval hospital ship would come to help. Mrs. Nakamura, hopeful for the doctor's arrival, put her children to bed. Meanwhile, Mr. Tanimoto continued ferrying the wounded across the river. Mr. Tanimoto pressed forward on foot, driven by the belief that there were still more people to save. Suddenly, he tripped over someone's hand, heard a weak protest, and grew furious at the doctors. Where were they in this desperate time of need? Dr. Fuji spent a painful night on the floor of his roofless house. By lantern light, he assessed his injuries: a fractured left clavicle, multiple cuts and bruises, and possibly a couple of broken ribs. He may have helped the wounded in Asano Park if he had not suffered such severe injuries. By nightfall, 10,000 victims had crowded the Red Cross hospital. Dr. Sasaki, worn out, bound only the worst cuts by candlelight. After 19 hours, he was too exhausted and went outside to sleep. Within an hour, the wounded found him, forming an angry circle around him. Miss Sasaki lay untreated beside a woman, missing a breast, and a man with severe facial burns. Her broken leg caused immense suffering, leaving her unable to sleep or interact with those around her. Being vulnerable is a strength that can ease your burden and build integrity. In the park, a heavy atmosphere hung over the survivors. Despite their severe ailments, Mrs. Nakamura's children remained curious about their surroundings. Mr. Tanimoto, worn out from his rescue efforts, dozed uneasily. At dawn, he made a heartbreaking discovery. The rising tide had claimed the lives of those he had carried to the sand spit, unable to move to safety. Key point 6. Healing in Hell. When the radio made its first brief announcement that Hiroshima had been attacked with a new type of weapon, survivors were too drained and hurt to care. Father Kleinsorge fetched water for the wounded. During one trip, he came across 20 soldiers with severely burned faces and damaged eyes. They begged for water, so Father Kleinsorge made a straw from a large piece of grass to help them drink. He promised them a doctor would come, but he didn't fully believe it. Miss Sasaki's leg looked monstrous. Without food or water for 3 days, she was eventually found by friends who told her that her family was likely dead. Men carried her to a relief station where a doctor debated amputating her leg. She fainted from shock, and her fever would not subside. Having slept only 1 hour in 3 days, Dr. Sasaki became obsessed with thoughts of his mother, worried that she didn't know he had survived. Upon reaching home and assuring her of his survival, he collapsed into a 17-hour slumber. A week after the bomb, rumors spread that Hiroshima was destroyed by a weapon that split atoms, called Genshi Bakuden, or original child bomb. Most people didn't understand or believe it, but Japanese physicists did. On August 12th, the still ailing Nakamuras moved to Kabe with Mrs. Nakamura's relatives. The following day, Mrs. Nakamura returned to Hiroshima, worried about her family in Fukuro, only to discover they had all perished. You can always start fresh, no matter where life has led you. The Red Cross Hospital gradually regained order. Relatives identified the dead, whose ashes were stored in envelopes and respectfully stacked in the main office, covering one whole side. In Japan, proper cremation and enshrinement of the dead is a sacred duty. On August 15th, Mrs. Nakamura met her sister, who had been away from Hiroshima during the attack. She whispered that the emperor had announced over the radio that the war was over. Like many Hiroshima residents, the two women wept together for a long time. Key point 7. The hidden dangers of radiation. Doctors in Hiroshima observed that after the bombing, many people faced 3 stages of a mysterious illness. Stage 1. Immediately after the explosion, survivors suffered from nausea, diarrhea, headaches, fatigue, and fever. Stage 2. Around day 10, people began losing their hair, and fevers persisted. By day 30, their gums bled, and white blood cell counts dropped, so wounds healed slowly. Stage 3. If people survived the first 2 stages, many patients succumbed to complications like chest infections. Burns healed with keloids, thick raised scars, and symptoms mirrored those of X-ray overdoses. Radiation sickness was peculiar. Those who rested after the bombing fared better than those who remained active. In some cases, people with flash burns were protected from the symptoms. Also, gray hair rarely fell out, and reproductive processes were temporarily affected. The rays simply destroyed body cells, caused their nuclei to degenerate, and broke their walls. John Hersey. Scientists studied Hiroshima, measuring the explosion's force and heat, which reached 6,000 degrees Celsius at its center. Despite censorship, Japanese scientists discovered the bombs were uranium at Hiroshima and plutonium at Nagasaki. This information spread, but most Hiroshima residents were indifferent to the bomb's ethics and mechanics, too terrified to contemplate it deeply. While some harbored deep resentment toward Americans, many Japanese adhered to the shikata gane principle, meaning it can't be helped. They focused on rebuilding the economy and moving forward rather than seeking revenge. It fostered a collective memory centered on a commitment to peace and preventing future nuclear catastrophes. Finding forgiveness doesn't mean excusing someone's actions. It's about freeing yourself from negative feelings. By 1950, it was clear that the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, hibakusha, faced severe long-term health effects. Leukemia rates were alarmingly high, along with an increased incidence of thyroid, breast, lung, salivary gland, liver, stomach, and urinary tract cancers. Besides cancer, they also suffered from anemia, liver dysfunction, sexual issues, endocrine disorders, and accelerated aging. This pervasive malaise added to the hibakusha's physical and emotional burden. Did you know? Research conducted in 2021 by Springer, a leading global scientific publisher, indicates that biological differences make women and children more susceptible to radiation's harmful effects. Key point 8. After 40 years. Each of the 6 survivors of the Hiroshima catastrophe forged their distinct life paths. Hatsuyo Nakamura found her sewing machine and worked without any days off, fighting the symptoms of radiation sickness. After getting better, she got a job at a factory. Her family received one of the houses built for Hiroshima victims and finally felt some stability. Her children grew up and supported her. Her son bought her a new sewing machine. Dr. Terufumi Sasaki opened his clinic, enjoying a happy family life and financial success. In 1963, he was diagnosed with lung cancer, likely from radiation. He overcame it, but his wife soon died of breast cancer. In turn, it deepened his resolve to save lives. His subsequent projects, a nursing home and hot springs, made him one of the wealthiest men in Hiroshima. Father Kleinsorg spent the rest of his life battling the effects of radiation exposure. Despite what the man had been through, he loved Japan with all his heart and took the name Father Makoto Takakura. Here, he met the love of his life, with whom he stayed until his death. Toshiko Sasaki underwent multiple operations, and her leg ached constantly. She could walk, but became convinced that her limp would prevent her from ever getting married. In 1954, Miss Sasaki joined a convent recommended by Father Takakura and became Sister Dominique Sasaki. There, she rose to the director position and became content with her life. Dr. Fuji started studying English, harboring no hostility toward former enemies. In 1956, he went to the U.S. to assist the Hiroshima maidens, young women severely disfigured by the atomic bomb, undergoing plastic surgery. Dr. Fuji played a fatherly role, lifting their spirits. On New Year's Eve, 1963, he survived a gas leak, but subsequently fell into a vegetative state, remaining so until he died in 1973. Kiyoshi Tanimoto was crucial in rebuilding Hiroshima. In 1948, during a trip to the U.S., he devised the idea for a World Peace Center to prevent future atomic bombings, which gained significant support. Tanimoto also assisted the Hiroshima maidens. After returning to Japan, he continued his advocacy for nuclear disarmament and lived modestly. Embrace opportunities and concentrate on solutions rather than lingering on the negative. Conclusion. In one way or another, the shadows of the Hiroshima tragedy lingered with every survivor. Residents often reflected on the twists of fate and small decisions that seemed to have made the difference between life and death. Their circumstances brought them face to face with unimaginable death and destruction, experiences that would haunt them forever. Try this. Learn about emergency response plans for various disasters, including radiation exposure, to ensure you and your family know what to do. Explore more about the history of World War II to gain a broader context for understanding the tragedy. Support organizations dedicated to humanitarian aid and disaster relief. Your contribution can help in current and future crises.